Almost all of us have ancestors whose lives were touched by World War I. 100 years on from the start of the war, memorials and remembrance everywhere give shape to its impact. Marlborough College is no exception. Many of its former pupils, beaks and staff were killed in combat. This film explores the war stories of some of the men and women connected to Marlborough and remembers the 749 individuals who lost their lives. The college's Memorial Hall represents a community coming to terms with what had happened. The building's architecture expresses a sense of renewal, with hope for the future. Inside the hall are recorded the names of the 749.
Just behind the chairs are the names of 749 men, that is students and staff who died in the First World War.
While our film tracks events in the mud and trenches of the Western Front, we shouldn't forget that the First World War was fought on other fronts we may not know so well. And the archive tells us that beyond the 749, there are many more whose lives were cut short by the war.
I think it's very unlikely that this list is the final list in any way.
Over several months, the task of uncovering the background and delving into the archives to explore details of the soldiers' stories has been undertaken by a small group of Marlborough pupils. From their research, we've taken extracts from letters, diaries and poems to illuminate personal experience.
When you see millions of the mouthless dead across your dreams in pale battalions go, say not soft things as other men have said that you'll remember, for you need not so. Give them not praise, for deaf, how should they know it is not curses heaped on each gashed head? Nor tears, their blind eyes see not your tears flow, nor honour. It is easy to be dead. Say only this, they are dead. Then add thereto, yet many a better one has died before. Then, scanning all your crowded mass, should you perceive one face that you loved heretofore, it is a spook. None wears the face you knew. Great death has made all his forevermore.
Regarded by some as the greatest loss of all the poets killed during the war, Charles Hamilton Sawley was a pupil at Marlborough College until 1913. The account of his experience and of what happened to him is the first in our series of interlinked stories.
Charles Hamilton Sawley.
As a child, Sawley, the son of a university professor, was partly educated at home by his mother. A scholarship took him to Marlborough when he was 13. Very much an individual, with a strong sense of place, Sawley's great passion was cross-country running. Images are threaded vividly through his poem, Letter to a School Friend from the Trenches.
Sons of one school across the sea, we have no fear to fight. And soon, oh soon, I do not doubt it, with the body or without it, we shall all come tumbling down to our old wrinkled, red-capped town. Perhaps the road up Ilsley way, the old ridge track will be my way. High up among the sheep and sky, look down on Wantage passing by, and see the smoke from Swindon town. And then full left at Liddington, where the four winds of heaven meet, the earth-blessed traveller to greet. And then my face is toward the south. There is a singing on my mouth. Away to rightward I descry my Barbary ensconced in sky, far underneath the Ogbourne twins, and at my feet the thyme and whins, the grasses with their little crowns of gold, the lovely Aldbourne downs, And that old signpost, well, I knew that crazy signpost, arms askew, old mother of the four grass ways. And then my mouth is dumb with praise. For past the wood and chalk pit tiny, a glimpse of Marlborough. So I descend beneath the rail to warmth and welcome and wassail. This from the battered trenches, rough, jingling and tedious enough. And so I sign myself to you, one who some crooked pathways knew round Bedwin, who could scarcely leave the downs on a December eve, was at his happiest in shorts, and got not many good reports, small skill of rhyming in his hand. But you'll forgive. You'll understand.
For our pupils, visiting the Western Front brought place and identity to their research, and a sense of scale to the losses.
That looks weird down there. It looks like dominoes lined up.
My name's Tom and I'm a pupil from Marlborough College, and I, along with some fellow pupils in my year, went to France and Belgium documenting the lives as best we could of Marlboroughans.
For me, it was a trip which put it into reality what had actually happened to them.
We went during the early summer, so it was beautiful settings, which was a massive juxtaposition considering the subject that we were considering.
Sidney Woodruff.
Killed in combat when he was just 19, Sidney Woodruff received a Victoria Cross for his bravery and initiative. A leading light while at Marlborough, he was also an active sportsman. Woodruff and 10 of his fellow pupils in this team photograph lost their lives in the war. Woodruff died at Hoog, where a water-filled bomb crater marks out the ground between British and German trenches. Now it's an open-air museum, with debris collected from battle littered along the rough line of the trenches. A century later, in the calm of a quiet summer morning, it's a place to reflect on the letters Sidney Woodruff wrote back to Marlborough shortly before his death.
If you read a lot of his letters, you feel like you know him quite well. So you'll read about his friends and what he's been doing, and obviously he's kind of the same age as me, just a bit older. And then kind of visiting the place where he died is very strange.
We were stuck in these trenches for 9 days on end, and I'll try to give you some idea of how beastly it was.
The place was the extreme tip of the furthest advanced part of our line, i.e. at the end of the well-known salient. This means that we were enfiladed by guns from both sides, and so were fired on from 3 directions at once. All the water in this God-forsaken country is undrinkable. And every drop of water we consumed in the trenches was brought up by hand in petrol tins over a mile at night. You never get your boots off the whole time you're in the trenches. And after about 10 days, a change of socks is decidedly desirable.
That's really sad as well, because he was writing to people who were still at Marlborough, and I just think it was a bit odd, and he was talking about all the different things he misses about the school.
Time drags in the trenches. Nothing done to further the interests of our country as far as one can see. There is nothing out here to make one believe the war will be over for a hell of a long time. How I would love to be able to get over to Marlborough College before you all leave.
I think it's important that we recognise the massive sacrifice, especially when so many Marlboroughans died. It's quite a big part of our school history. And it's also just really important that we kind of remember all the men who died. I think they would have wanted that.
Among the dead, Sidney's brother Kenneth. A letter from him appeared in the Marlboroughan magazine, December 17th, 1914.
One of the men in my company was killed yesterday. Did they bury him? Good Lord, no. They put him lengthways on top of the trench to heighten the head cover, and calmly sat down underneath him and had their breakfast. These Welshmen are perfectly grand. They're a rough lot and their language is unique, but they can't fight. They've had an awful time since they came out, and from the 1,600 of them, only about 350 are left.
But Sidney had another brother. He died while fighting at the front in 1916.
The Marlburian, June the 21st, 1916. The sympathy of the whole Marlburian world will go out to Mr. and Mrs. Woodroffe in this final loss. They offered all, and alas, they have lost all.
A.J. White.
It's pretty clear that however far from home they were, some of Marlborough's former pupils felt the tug of Wiltshire's landscape, a memory that played vividly in their imaginations. For A.J. White, Wiltshire's farms and fields were closely connected to his sense of identity.
A.J. grew up on Charnage Farm. Folded deep within the Wiltshire countryside, Charnage gave him a settled and rural childhood. And all looked set for a life in farming.
Arthur John Stanley White, always known by his first two initials, AJ, except by his family. His family called him Stanley, but everyone called him AJ. He came from a good farming stock from this very room, from Charnage Farm, and was expected, as the eldest son, to take over the farm. But I think, as someone has said of him, he didn't like cows. So I think the family knew from pretty early on he was not going to take over the farm. So off he went to Marlborough.
As soon as he could, and inspired by a strong sense of duty, A.J. joined up and found himself in France, sent to join up with the Wiltshire Regiment. But when he arrived, things weren't quite as he'd anticipated.
He got off the train and they were making their way on a lorry, I think, and he hopped off the lorry to walk up to the dugouts, and there was the groom of the colonel. The colonel's groom was lying in the road, dying, because he'd been shot accidentally. And he was lying in the road dying, and that was my father said, and that was the first dead body I'd seen.
Amongst the memorabilia is a set of recordings A.J. made long after the war. He remembers joining his regiment, the authentic voice of first-hand experience.
They were in the front line at the time, near Thiepval, which was one of the worst spots in the whole Battle of the Somme. In fact, I had arrived, I suppose, at about the worst time, at the worst spot, in the worst battle probably in history, because the slaughter on the Somme, as everyone knows, had been terrific.
Although conditions in the trenches were appalling, it wasn't fear that prevailed.
Being in the front line, it did not in itself cause one to have any fear of danger, except when there was a burst of shell fire. And that was the case even though we knew that the Germans were only 100 yards away from us.
Pitched into combat at the Battle of Messines, A.J. was confronted with the reality of action.
They go over the top. And he said that it was almost exhilarating. I mean, he was 20 years old. He must have felt fear, but I think it must have been relief. I don't know. He just says it was almost exhilarating.
Under attack and against orders, A.J.'s batman Mullings left their trench for a short while. A.J. remembers the devastating consequence.
In no time, he was hit by a shell. He lay there on his back in the trench, and I could see that he must be very dangerously wounded. A splinter had gone into the lower part of his back. I said to him, "Mullings, how are you?" I don't think he recognized me. He said, "Bloody rough." And I should think They may have been the last words he uttered. He died 2 days later. It was a great loss because he was a very gallant man and an excellent servant.
The Menin Gate Memorial in Ypres is dedicated to the British and Commonwealth soldiers who were killed in the Ypres salient and whose graves are unknown. Every single day, a brief ceremony of remembrance takes place. On the first evening of their visit, Marlborough's pupils lay their own wreath.
We will remember them.
Sidney Woodruff's name is here. And his courage is recorded in the citation for his Victoria Cross.
Sidney Woodruff's Victoria Cross citation. The enemy having broken through the centre of our front trenches consequent on the use of burning liquids, this officer's position was heavily attacked with bombs from the flank and subsequently from the rear. But he managed to defend his post until all his bombs were exhausted, and then skillfully withdrew his remaining men. This very gallant officer immediately led his party forward in a counterattack under intense rifle and machine gun fire, and was killed whilst in the act of cutting the wire obstacles in the open.
Charles Sawley, the poet, knew Woodruff from their days at Marlborough College, and he marked his death with a written tribute.
In Memoriam, SCW, VC. There is no fitter end than this. No need is now to yearn nor sigh. We know the glory that is his, a glory that can never die. Surely we knew it long before, knew all along that he was made for a swift, radiant morning, for a sacrificing, swift nightshade.
Away from the front line, on the home front, air raids brought the horror of war to London and to other places. But in spite of the loss of loved ones, hope and renewal were entwined with the hardships. Amongst the stories is that of Marjorie Secretan, whose letters and diaries from the First World War have been collated by her son and her grandson.
We edited a book of letters which is based on around 800 letters that were written by Marjorie, other members of the families. In fact, 4 families are all interconnected, of whom 3 of the letter writers were actually old Marlboroughans.
Most of the letters are between Marjorie and her fiancé Francis Dodgson, Toby. Toby Dodgson was killed on the Western Front. A stone memorial is close to the spot where he died.
Dodgson's memorial is in the middle of a field, in this wheat field, and there's nothing around, and it's this amazing striking landscape. And then it's just kind of a really small memorial to Dodgson, and it kind of put into perspective how each life is so little in this vast place.
That was very tranquil. It was a small village, and we kind of got out there, got to the memorial stone and sat down and read some letters.
Just 2 weeks before Toby was killed, Marjorie writes to him.
My darling old thing, I'm wondering very much if events are going to move in France. Everyone seems to expect it. I wish you had explained where your little village is. I take it is behind the lines, which is a great blessing.
Filled with happiness as she prepares for their wedding, the letter is a celebration.
By the way, it's early yet, but do you mind one way or another if I am married in white, in a veil, or in a hat, etc.? I don't know at all where or how it will all take place, but I would like to know your opinion. My aunt nearly had a fit today when I said I might be married in an ordinary frock, and said you would not like it. So I want to know. Of course, we can't decide anything till I hear what Ma and Pa think about how it's going to be done. Ever so much love and kisses, from Marjorie.
A letter from Toby reports good spirits and high morale amongst his soldiers.
I got yours of the 26th yesterday, and I'm glad to hear that you're still fit. I don't feel equal to discussing marriage problems until after the great push. It all seems such a long way away. You can imagine how bucked up we all were yesterday, to wake up and find a real summer's day at last. Blue sky and sun shining, everyone is as keen as mustard.
But then, in a letter to Marjorie from Toby Dodgson's mother, Helen, comes bad news.
Dearest Marjorie, I have had a wire from the War Office saying this. I regret to inform you that Captain Dodgson was reported missing on 11th of July. This does not necessarily mean he is killed or wounded. We'll report on further news immediately. Oh Marjorie, I'm afraid I have no hope, but I ought to hope I know.
Nothing is confirmed at that moment, though Toby's mother fears the worst.
But missing is so hopeless. I don't know whereabouts he was. I wish I was near you and could be with you. We are trying to telephone to the Red Cross, who are said to know all things. I shall go up to the War Office tomorrow and will let you know at once if I hear anything further. Send me a line if you feel you can. Oh my dear, I am so sorry for us both. God grant he may be only missing. Yours, Helen. We were all pretending to be each character and sitting around there reading the letters, and so you could really see how the relationships intertwined.
The language that they used was obviously very genuine, very moving.
Toby was killed on the 10th of July, 1916. A year later, Marjorie meets and then marries another Marlborougherian, Charles Fair.
They clearly connected over whatever it was, and maybe it was him helping her with her grief over her fiancé.
I knew she'd been engaged and he'd been killed, but she met my father and fell for him and married him. I mean, and my father never worried him. I mean, he was just one of the lucky people who'd survived the First War, and Toby didn't. And we always had a picture of Toby hanging in our house here.
A light still burns for Toby, and his presence in Marjorie's life is kept alive, even in letters Charles writes home from the front.
Charles to Marjorie, 4th of December 1917. The battalion has had a rough time, but I am so awfully proud of them. Many of my friends are not with us now, but as regards officers, there are not any killed or dead that we know of. I forgot to tell you that in my wild chase after the battalion, I passed within half a mile of Toby's grave. It may have been a little fanciful, but as I passed the village, I raised my hand in salute to his memory. Because I owe him you, darling, and nothing can ever repay that debt to his memory.
Siegfried Sassoon.
Perhaps the best known of Marlborough College's World War I pupils is the poet Siegfried Sassoon. Decorated for bravery on the Western Front, his writings describe the horror of the trenches and satirise what he believed to be the patriotic pretensions of jingoism back at home.
Like Sassoon, one of our research pupils boards in Cotton House and finds connections with his everyday life at Marlborough.
Certainly in-house there's a lot of things about him. To know that he kind of walked the halls that I walked, in a way, maybe followed my life closer than any of the other characters did, gave me more motivation to kind of cover him as best I could.
Dennis Silk, who taught at Marlborough, was a close friend of Sassoon until the poet's death in 1967, and understood what drove his writing.
He is always telling the truth, whatever people from the outside believe. Siegfried was on the side of the private soldier, and he would have died for them, and very nearly did.
Sassoon looked upon the war with clear eyes and was not afraid to speak out. Siegfried's reputation for courage under fire in the trenches gave him the Mad Jack label.
Mad Jack was mad because he was always of a nightfall crawling out to see what the situation was like.
Aftermath. Have you forgotten yet? For the world's events have rumbled on since those gagged days, like traffic checked while at the crossing of city ways. And the haunted gap in your mind has filled with thoughts that flow like clouds in the lit heaven of life. And you're a man reprieved to go, taking your peaceful share of time with joy to spare. But the past is just the same, and war's a bloody game. Have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war that you'll never forget. Do you remember the dark months you held the sector at Mametz? The nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags on parapets? Do you remember the rats and the stench of corpses rotting in front of the front-line trench? And dawn coming dirty white and chill with a hopeless rain? Do you ever stop and ask, is it all going to happen again? Do you remember that hour of din before the attack, and the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you then, as you peered at the doomed and haggard faces of your men? Do you remember the stretcher cases lurching back with dying eyes and lolling heads, those ashen grey masks of the lads who once were keen and kind and gay? Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you will never forget.
At Mametz Wood in July 1916, Sassoon's relentless courage in fierce combat begins to explain his Mad Jack nickname.
In his diaries, writing about creeping through the trenches at Mametz Wood, Sassoon records the way he single-handedly put a stop to dangerous and potentially devastating sniper fire. So how does Dennis remember him?
I think of him in Mametz Wood doing what many people would never have dreamed of doing, and emptying of Germans at total risk to his own life.
I sat in Mametz Wood and recounted some of his poems, and it was very strange to be where they were, and it's all very different to us now, and it's quite hard to imagine what it was like for them.
To read in the place where he wrote it, in the trench that he wrote it, you just get a sense of the conflict as a whole.
Dreamers. Soldiers are citizens of death's grey land, drawing no dividend from time's tomorrows. In the great hour of destiny they stand, each with his feuds and jealousies and sorrows. Soldiers are sworn to action. They must win some flaming, fatal climax with their lives. Soldiers are dreamers. When the guns begin, they think of firelit homes, clean beds and wives.
Siegfried was a man with a mission, and the mission was to save the lives of those people who he looked after. He was, from my point of view, the most amazing man I've ever known.
At his home studio, Dennis Silk reads and records some of Sassoon's verse.
When you're ready.
Okay.
Okay.
Off you go.
Stand to, Good Friday morning. I'd been on duty from 2 till 4. I went and stared at the dugout door. Down in the Faust, I heard them snore. Stand to! Somebody grunted and swore. Dawn was misty, the skies were still. Larks were singing, discordant, shrill. They seemed happy, but I felt ill. Deep in water I splashed my way up the trench to our bogged front line. Rain had fallen the whole damn night. Oh, Jesus, send me a wound today, and I'll believe in your bread and wine, and get my bloody old sins washed white.
In charting the course of the First World War and the impact it had upon life at Marlborough, we shouldn't neglect the college's Memorial Hall, the Mem Hall, designed and built to represent a reflective view of the war.
Well, the Memorial Hall 100 years on is highly significant in that it reminds the current Marlboroughans, boy or girl, of the selflessness of giving back to society at a later stage and of what they learn as a part of the whole process of being a Marlboroughan.
Over the decades, the identity and purpose of the Memorial Hall gets stronger.
The brick courtyard in front of it is all part of a landscaping scheme that included the rose garden, the Mem Hall, the chapel, and a pool of remembrance, and a sort of vista from the west end of chapel that looked towards the setting sun.
While the names of the 749 are carved into the walls of the hall, the rolls of honour show us just who each individual was.
This is the Rolls of Honour. It's the Rolls of Honour cabinet, and it's all the people who died in the First World War, arranged by house, with a photograph and a citation done in copper plate, beautiful calligraphy for each one of them.
The hall is acquiring new significance 100 years later.
Well, we have to develop it so we can get as many of the school in as we possibly can. And really to honour the vision of the original Memorial Hall, which was to have been a much bigger place. It was at one stage going to have been probably a full circle. In the end, they had to settle for a semicircle. But there are things we can do to it which will enable us to get a school of now nearly 930 pupils into it so that we actually do honour those that fell.
Harry Fox.
My name is Richard Fox, and I was at Littlefield in the 1950s. My father was Harry Fox, and he was at Cotton House just before the war, joined up in autumn 1917, and with a few absences for being wounded and leave, went through the rest of the war and up to the armistice.
Richard Fox donated his father's papers and memorabilia to the college's archive. It's a store box of personal experience.
Well, the story of the little suitcase is that I didn't even know it existed until I moved house from where my father used to live 20 years ago, and I read the letters. I realized straight away that my father would wish these memoirs to go to Marlborough.
So in the case, we have your father's diaries that we're putting here that he...
Perhaps the most important notebook in the case is Harry Fox's memoirs of his experiences in World War I.
Now, he felt moved to write these about 18 months after the war, and he wrote everything down in detail in chronological order, and he writes about everything. Any Marlboroughan that he meets gets into the diary.
I've noticed that.
Encounters with other Marlboroughans were a source of companionship and warmth for Harry,
Exactly.
and prompted diary entries that recaptured college life.
Puts that down as something very important to him.
Well, Marlborough meant a lot to him, otherwise I wouldn't have come here myself.
Yes, yes.
A field notebook in the case is a rich source of information about practical aspects of a soldier's life.
There is a list of what he had to take with him, down to very, very fine details, including a thing written as housewife, pronounced husif, which happens to be, I know, the equipment you need for darning your socks. Just a bit of wool and a needle.
He obviously wanted to go to war because he went as soon as he could, didn't he?
Yes, everybody did.
From his time at Marlborough, Harry Fox acquired values that became central to his identity.
defend freedom, I think, is something that they all...
I think I learnt the same things here that my father did. An idea of public service, an idea that you are not your own man, you're here to live for other people, not yourself. And it's almost as simple as that.
A maths scholar at school and an artillery officer in the field, Harry carefully recorded the moments leading up to an assault.
September the 27th, the attack by the 6th Corps. Harassing fire was continued to within 5 minutes of the barrage, which was timed to begin at 5:20 a.m. At 5:15, there was a lull. An expectant silence seemed to hang over the landscape. Furtive movements of men moving ammunition could be heard, an occasional order. And then, 3 minutes to go, 2 minutes to go, 1 minute. Every officer examining his watch. 30 seconds, 20, 10, 5. Shrill blasts from a multitude of whistles, drowned almost instantaneously by a thunder of reports, which grew within 5 seconds to a roar. The most perfectly timed barrage I had ever heard.
Had been more or less exhausted.
Held in the archives, the memories of Harry Fox will live on.
It made me realize
First-hand experiences of a war that will never be forgotten.
I feel I have a sort of communication with my father in a funny sort of way, and I feel that he's thrilled to bits up there that we're here now doing what we're doing. Now you may think I'm bats, and I may be bats, but that's what I feel.
Talbot House in Belgium is visited by the pupils. Once a resting place for soldiers just behind the front line, it's now a living museum.
Du, meine weiche Frau, sorgst für Beruf. Thank you, my wife. It's like a right.
The Pool of Peace, also belonging to Talbot House, is the site of mine craters exploded in June 1917. A place for the Marlborough pupils to pause.
I think it's really nice to think that somewhere which was so horrible 100 years ago, it's kind of grown into the landscape, and nowadays it's a memorial for the people, not for the actual devastation.
And read a Charles Sawley poem.
Such is death, no triumph, no defeat, only an empty pail, a slate rubbed clean, a merciful putting away of what has been. And this we know, death is not life effete. Life crushed the broken pail. We who have not seen so marvellous things know well the end not yet. Victor and vanquished are one in death, coward and brave, friend, foe. Ghosts do not say, come what was your record when you drew breath, but a big blot has hid each yesterday. So poor, so manifestly incomplete, and your bright promise withered long and sped, is touched, stirs, rises and opens and grows sweet, and blossoms and is you when you are dead.
In his last letters from the front, Charles Sawley was only too aware of the fine line between life and death.
To the Master of Marlborough, October the 5th, 1915. I have just time, or rather paper, for that is at present more valuable than time, enough to send a reply to your welcome letter, which arrived with the bacon. The chess players are no longer waiting so infernal long between their moves, and the patient pawns are all in movement, hourly expecting further advances, whether to be taken or reach the back lines and be queened. 'Tis sweet, this pawn being. There are no cares, no doubts, therefore no regrets.
Elsie Knocker.
While images of British Tommies at the Western Front remain sharply focused and hugely powerful, we should remember that women were also at the front line. Diane Atkinson's book, Elsie and Marie Go to War, records the story of two extraordinary women on the Western Front.
My name is Diane Atkinson, and I've written a book called Elsie and Marie Go to War, which is about an extraordinary woman called Elsie Knocker, who had a very close relationship with Marlborough College, because her adoptive father was Lewis Upcott, who is a very esteemed classics master at Marlborough College.
Fiercely independent, before 1914, Elsie had earned a reputation as one of a small number of celebrated women motorcyclists. But once war is declared, her impulse is to get involved.
She goes off to war with Mari as a sense of, we must go and do something useful. So they go to London first of all. They work for a charitable dispatch riders company called the Women's Emergency Corps. Mari is spotted by a man called Dr. Hector Munro. He chases after her in a taxi and says, "You're a very good motorcyclist." She said, "Thank you very much." He said, "I'd like you to come with my motor ambulance corps to Belgium because I want to take women with my ambulance corps to show that women can do what men can do. So will you come and be one of our drivers?" She says, "I'd love to. And may I bring my friend Elsie Locker? She's a nurse as well. She's done some nursing training and she's a very good driver. Can she come too?" He said, "Yes, okay."
The two women arrive in Belgium, join the Flying Ambulance Corps, and begin work as drivers who provide medical support.
Their job is to drive out in ambulances and bring in the wounded. And on the way, they realise, especially Elsie actually notices with her nursing training, that a lot of the men who they're bringing in actually have survivable injuries. But they are dying on the journey home because of the road conditions and the trauma of being moved too quickly.
Before long, Elsie sets up her own first aid post in the cellar of a house right beside the front line. Amongst the shattered buildings and ruined landscape, it's far from being a safe place. Space, comfort, and facilities are severely constrained.
I think it must have been beyond difficult. There are accounts of them escaping shells. They were bombed as much, obviously they were right on the front line, so they were bombed as much as the front line was. So they were pretty much in the same situations that the men were. It must have been difficult for them because their basement was only something like 5 metres by 7, and you can hardly stand up and there's water dripping from the ceiling and from the walls. It's just horrible.
There's more than a hint of the fact that Elsie's bravery, independence, and sense of leadership came from Lewis Upcott and the ethos of Marlborough College.
I think the Upcotts allowed her to flourish and to be part of the world of boys and men. And I think she kind of sort of imitated these leadership roles that were being drummed into students all the time. And I think she sort of thought, well, I can do that.
I think it's interesting to consider women's part in the war. I don't think we often focus on the effects of the war in terms of sort of enfranchisement of women, but it's amazing to see how two women made such a big impact and were quite famous actually during the war and were living in the same dangerous situations as men.
As news of their courage and expertise spread, Elsie and Mari became national figures and highly influential, not least because of Elsie's personal qualities.
I think she was extremely kind and extremely devoted and extremely organising, if not controlling, and a brilliant leader. She's brilliant in an emergency because she's just able to sort of delegate like mad and take a grip of the situation.
Very, very brave. I can't even imagine anything like it. There was a story of how Elsie on Christmas Day was taking hot chocolate and socks and cigarettes to the troops, and a German soldier popped his head out of a trench and said, "Oi, what are you doing?" She said, "Taking hot chocolate to the British troops, do you want some?" So very, very brave, but also very mad.
Throughout the Great War, and in the years since its end, there's always been more than one view of the war and what it represents. Amongst others, Siegfried Sassoon felt a strong sense of unease and wrote about the disconnect between attitudes on the home front and life in the trenches.
They. The bishop tells us, "When the boys come back, they will not be the same, for they'll have fought in a just cause. They lead the last attack on Antichrist. Their comrades' blood has bought new right to breed an honourable race. They have challenged death and dared him face to face. We're none of us the same," the boys reply. But George lost both his legs and Bill's stone blind. Poor Jim's shot through the lungs and like to die, and Bert's gone syphilitic. You'll not find a chap who's served that hasn't found some change. And the bishop said, "The ways of God are strange."
In college music and around Marlborough's buildings are reminders of events and attitudes to the First World War.
In the shadow of the chapel is a memorial rose garden. Over the entrance is an inscription in Greek. Within this quiet garden close, though o'er all lands our graves lie spread, still do we live and walk with those whose thoughts are with the dead. Inside Solley's boarding house, a silver plaque records the losses.
In unforgetting memory of the old members of this house who gave their lives 1914 to 1918. Being dead, they live.
Beside the chapel is a stone monument.
Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee the crown of life.
High above the altar is a stained glass window with a dedication that deserves our closer attention.
The chapel choir were singing the words To Expectans Expectavi, a poem written by one of the greatest of the old Marlboroughans. His name was Charles Hamilton Sorley, and this year and next we should be hearing a lot more from him. So let us pray now.
Ernest Cross.
Ernest Cross was the school chaplain who found himself taking part in the Battle of the Somme.
The Battle of the Somme began on the first day of July 1916. Visiting Belgium for their research, in weather very similar to that of the combat, Marlborough's pupils discover what happened to the Devonshires.
This is the monument at the entrance to the cemetery.
It was to the Devonshire Regiment that Ernest Cross was attached.
So this is literally what we're about to move into here, this cemetery here, let's go in, is actually the position of the front line trench on the first day of the Somme. And the graves in the cemetery pretty much mark the line of where that trench would be. Take away those trees.
The geography of the landscape was about to cause the Devonshires huge problems and compromise their advance.
Traditional sort of position for German, what have we said all along on this trip? Wherever there's high ground, who sits on it?
Germans.
Yeah, the Germans sit on the high ground.
Just across from where the Devonshires were entrenched in the front line was this small valley, and then up the slope the other side towards the village that they were attacking, the village of Mametz. Just on the edge of the village, facing back across towards where the British were coming from, was this little town cemetery. And it projects out from the small slope beneath the village there. And in the corner of that cemetery, behind a high hedge or wall, whatever it was then, nowadays it's a hedge, but it may not have been then, was a German machine gun position.
The fighting approach into Mametz village was from the point at which the graves stand now, across an open valley. There was very little cover. Taking the route across the valley would bring the soldiers directly into the line of fire of the German machine gun post. The risk was great. Officers reported the attack as too dangerous, but their observations were overruled, and the advance began.
The Devonshires came out of their trench to attack Mamet's village, crossed down across the valley, and had to pass up into the village along something called Shrine Alley, which lies just beneath where that cemetery was, and they were mown down to a man. And Cross actually says in his memoirs, when he's in his diary, when he talks about collecting the dead, how they had almost all fallen at one point.
In his diary entries, Ernest Cross later wrote about coping with the consequences.
With a party of 50 men of the 8th and 20 of the 9th, I started to collect the dead. We made a collecting station at the foot of the copse, where Sergeant Newcomb collected identity discs and personal effects. Altogether, we collected 163 Devons and covered them up in Mansell copse. A colossal thunderstorm about 2 p.m. delayed us sorely. At 6 p.m, in the presence of the General, Foss, Milne, and about 60 men, I read the funeral service and the thanksgiving for victory. The working party was dead beat, and the task of filling in the trench was awfully slow. The next day, I got the pioneer sergeant to paint a board with red lead borrowed from the REs, and then went up to Mansell Copse to mark the cemetery. I put up the board. Cemetery of 163 Devons, killed July 1st, 1916.
Ernest Cross remained with the Devonshires until the end of the war, witnessing much more of the horror in battle. When it was all over, he returned to Marlborough College, deeply scarred by his experiences. And in 1919, he found himself having to preach a challenging sermon in the college chapel.
I think it was immensely difficult. I mean, especially for someone wearing a dog collar. And I think of that day when he came to stand back here in front of a school which he'd served in and probably didn't recognise any longer. And I think maybe I should illustrate that by reading something of the sermon that he gave that day when he came back here. 4 years' absence have left me so out of touch with school life that I do not feel qualified to work out this contention in the details of your experience. So much of it seems to me now unreal and artificial, especially in the religious atmosphere of the school, that I dare not trust myself to let fly my thoughts. You see, we have a man here who'd been through an extraordinary trauma, who'd met with adversity, who'd performed the greatest acts of physical courage I think one human being can perform for another. And so you can quite understand perhaps why it was that he felt, as he stood in the pulpit, inadequate.
In spite of everything he had seen and experienced, Cross believed in hope, and described in that same sermon how faith sustained him.
My own belief, which came I know not whence, that Christianity is the key to the riddle of the world, upheld me throughout the war, and pointed with no wavering light to the goal of our toils. If you believe Christianity, you may not be rich, you may not be what the world calls successful. Jesus was neither. You will be a good soldier, whether it be in war or peace. Jesus was. And so he comes, I think, to a happy conclusion at the end of this sermon. And it's clear that he clings to the values which had sustained him, this hope. And it was a hope, I think, which would have resonated enormously with boys, because that's what it was at that time, who had sat here throughout the war. It must have given them hope that even in the face of all that terrible loss, there was something better, and that they too could be part of that something better. And I think that's a mighty impressive thing.
As a community, Marlborough's pupils and staff continue to honour the 749 who died in the Great War. For the pupils, back at Marlborough after their visit to the Western Front, it's a time of reflection.
Marlborough had been where they had been living. It's kind of a family here. What they were missing was family life. That's what they associated Marlborough with.
I just think it's so sad. Like, obviously all of these men wouldn't have been very old, and to leave Marlborough being really young and then die was just so shocking.
When I came home, I just couldn't stop thinking about it, and I was just thinking, I still can't even imagine it, which just shows the disparity between my experience and their experience sort of 100 years ago. Definitely very, very emotional.
And there was quite an odd atmosphere. Like, no one speaks. It's just silent at these places. That's not a rule, but everyone just doesn't speak.
Because these boys who are out there had just left school, some of them had lied about their age and gone. And so they were our age, they were 17 or 18, and I think that's what struck me, that their lives were just cut short.
As the war ended, in one short poem, Siegfried Sassoon captured the elation people must have felt, although his language is far from triumphal, drawing us instead towards the future.
Everyone sang. Everyone suddenly burst out singing, and I was filled with such delight as prisoned birds must find in freedom, winging wildly across the white orchards and dark green fields. On, and out of sight. Everyone's voice was suddenly lifted, and beauty came like the setting sun. My heart was shaken with tears, and horror drifted away. Oh, but everyone was a bird, and the song was wordless. The singing will never be done.
Remember,